In an interview on Canadian radio, GM of BioWare Aaron Flynn shared details on their upcoming game, Anthem. He explained it will be set in science fantasy more like Star Wars rather than hardcore science fiction like Mass Effect. Hey guys, JV here sharing my thoughts on Anthem's setting. In this video, we'll look at examples of science fantasy and science fiction in video games as well as film so we can know what to expect with Anthem. As always, if you like what I do here and want to see more, be sure to subscribe. Before we even look at what BioWare said about science fantasy and Anthem, let's talk about the difference between science fiction and science fantasy, because it's very easy to not know the difference and confuse the two. Keep in mind when I'm explaining this stuff, I'm no literary expert or film buff. I'm a guy who is curious about this topic and I can use Google, so just know what to expect from this video. We're going to start with definitions of science fiction and fantasy from people who totally know what they're talking about. According to prolific science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, the difference between science fiction and fantasy is that science fiction, given its grounding in science, is possible. Fantasy, which has no grounding in reality, is not. Rod Serling of the early 60s cult classic The Twilight Zone claimed that science fiction is the improbable made possible, while science fantasy is the impossible made probable. Science fantasy gives a scientific veneer of realism to things that simply could not happen in the real world under any circumstances. Where science fiction does not permit the existence of fantasy or supernatural elements, science fantasy explicitly relies upon them. Both of these definitions revolve around the ideas of possibility, whether something is possible, and realism, whether something is rooted in reality or not. They make a clear distinction. Science fiction deals with what is possible and grounded in reality, whereas science fantasy deals with what is impossible and not grounded in reality. And I wanted to add another idea into the mix, something that they don't explain here, which I've personally observed. I could or could not be wrong, but I've also found that science fantasy shows an unwillingness to explain certain things, whereas science fiction will certainly explain things in depth and let you know why and how things are happening. We'll explore more of that when we get into examples, but first things first, let's go back to Anthem. They say, BioWare explains that this is science fantasy. That's what we should expect. And the quote from the Eurogamer article that I've linked in the description below is that Anthem is very much like Star Wars, very much like the Marvel universe. You will see a lot of amazing things happening, but we don't worry too much about why they are happening or how they are happening, the science of it. That explanation of science fantasy is almost exactly in line with our definitions from Isaac Asimov and Rod Serling, almost exactly. So we know what to expect with Anthem in terms of its setting. Now I'm going to go through a few examples of science fiction and science fantasy in video games and film, and keep in mind these are not black and white. You can totally argue the opposite. Some in fact include crossover between the two. You can find specific examples and we'll go over these. Starting with science fantasy, the big one in video games for me is Destiny. Bungie and Activision's looter shooter is science fantasy, and a lot of that comes from this light versus dark explanation, good versus evil, the Traveler, this giant space being that has descended on Earth, but we know nothing about it, and Bungie's obvious unwillingness to explain really anything going on with the lore and the backstory of the game. They'll explain it kind of subtly through story missions, but nothing is super in depth. And we actually know that Destiny 2 won't include the darkness at all because Bungie themselves don't know what it is. And that's not a hot take or a spin on anything. Bungie themselves said this. They don't know what the darkness is, and they're not going to explain it because they can't explain it themselves within their own fiction. The darkness is unexplainable. Now imagine if Bungie did have an explanation for the darkness, if they had some kind of reasoning rooted in reality for why this is the ultimate evil in the Destiny universe, it would be closer to science fiction, but they straight up are unwilling to explain things because it is unexplainable. And that is why Destiny is science fantasy. And after looking into the difference between these two settings of science fiction and fantasy, that's probably why reality fell far short of my expectations for Destiny. Coming in as a fan of Mass Effect, Destiny I expected to be science fiction when it was in fact science fantasy. Another example of science fantasy, this time in film, I guess you could say video games too, is Star Wars. We all know about the Force. The Force is a supernatural magical power wielded by many characters across films, books, video games, whatever it may be. We have the light side of the Force with Jedi, that's the good side, versus the dark side, the bad side, with the Sith. Now in the prequel films, we did get an explanation for Force sensitivity with midichlorians, and that is kind of a scientific explanation, but it's more of a scientific flavor, not rooted in reality. And George Lucas explains that the Force overall was created as a sort of non-denominational religious concept to depict good versus evil. It was also because he didn't want to have to explain contemporary religions within this fictional universe. While a lot of people do agree that Star Wars is mostly science fantasy, it is more than fair to argue that Star Wars is science fiction as well, because there are a lot of technology-based science fiction explanations in Star Wars. If you want to look into the very specific explanations for a lot of stuff going on, you can find them within Star Wars. And this is just one example of many you can find where they cross over. Now let's shift our attention over to science fiction and examples of that. And we're starting out with Mass Effect, again, one of my favorite video game franchises. I think the intro text at the very beginning of the first original Mass Effect game spells out exactly why Mass Effect is science fiction. In 2148, explorers on Mars discovered the remains of an ancient spacefaring civilization. The artifacts revealed startling new technologies, enabling travel to the furthest stars. They called it the greatest discovery in human history. The civilizations of the galaxy call it Mass Effect. We know that this futuristic universe and IP of Mass Effect exists because there was a significant discovery that propelled civilization into the future, into a golden age of spacefaring. Additionally, we have the Codex, which is just huge. There is so much information and explanation about technology, alien races, extended lore of this futuristic setting. Everything that you'd really want to know about Mass Effect is explained within the game. And that's what I always loved about Mass Effect. It felt possible. It felt like this could be the future, potentially, if the human race survives that long. Another example is with biotics. It's kind of like space magic. However, we know the reason this exists is because of this radioactive material called Element Zero. If you're exposed to it while you're in the womb, you may have biotic powers or you may die. Now, of course, you can find specific examples where Mass Effect dips into science fantasy territory, particularly with the Star Child at the end of Mass Effect 3. That is some trippy stuff going on. There's a lot of explanations about indoctrination, which that concept itself is a little bit science fantasy, but it's pretty well explained. Overall, though, the original trilogy really shows the difference between wanting to explain something and having concrete explanations for these fantastical concepts versus not willing to explain them and just saying, that's the way it is. My final example for science fiction is with Fallout. Fallout is a great example because there's this whole alternate history timeline that diverged from the real world after World War II. This world of retrofuturism is caused by the microprocessor not being invented. The transistor, invented in our world in 1947, was not developed in Fallout until more than 100 years later. That's why a lot of the technology, for example, computers, take up a bunch of room. They look prehistoric. You know, most things that you wonder about in the Fallout universe have a direct explanation, and I think that's thanks to the incredibly creative minds of the original Interplay Entertainment that conceived of this IP. Fallout is, for the most part, science fiction, but radiation causes all kinds of wacky things to happen. You could definitely argue that it's more like science fantasy in some cases, but I think it is rooted in science fiction. Circling back to Anthem, what does science fantasy mean for this game and what we can expect? And I think we heard it straight from BioWare. Their focus with Anthem in terms of the setting and the story is not on explaining the why or how of what goes on. When we're dealing with science fantasy, we need to expect some BioWare explanations to be because we said so, or because it is, along the same lines of Destiny. Now, I think that BioWare can pull it off better than Destiny. I think it's a great example of how not to do lore because there was massive backlash. And don't get me wrong here, that doesn't necessarily mean that Anthem will be good or bad, whether it's science fantasy or science fiction, but it's definitely up to us as an audience, as the consumers, to prepare our expectations accordingly. Personally, I made this mistake with Destiny. I expected lore explanations and to learn why or how things are the way that they are because the world was so fascinating. And I was disappointed because Bungie very clearly was unwilling to explain those things. I'll come out clear as day and admit that science fiction fiction is my preference of the two. I'm looking at Fallout and Mass Effect as some of my favorite video game franchises ever. I find it fascinating to know why and how. That doesn't mean I can't enjoy science fantasy, like Star Wars. Star Wars is awesome. I'm not a super mega fan, but I really enjoy the movies. So to me, that doesn't mean that Anthem won't be enjoyable either, just we have to prepare ourselves. We're not going to get another Mass Effect with Anthem. I had a blast looking into and learning the difference between science fiction and fantasy, but I'd love to turn it over to you guys. Do you prefer science fiction more along the lines of Fallout and Mass Effect, or do you prefer science fantasy like Star Wars and Anthem? Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. If you're still watching and you enjoy the video, click the like button and subscribe for more content like this. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook so you don't miss another video. Sign up with Juniper to receive exclusive discounts on shirts, hoodies, and more at the JV merch store. Click the link in the description below for more details. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.